Hey folks, I'm Saeed, the Codogrammer, and in this video, we're going to look at Kotlin variable basics. So let's get into it. So here we are inside a Kotlin project. You can see on the left there, and I'm just going to minimize that. So Kotlin variables are used to store values as they are in many other programming languages. Now, they're not always really variable. That name is misleading because you can't always change the values that they hold. So here we have a very simple variable declaration. The variable name is X and the value is ABC in quotes, which indicates a string. Now this has a type, which I already mentioned, which is string. If I hover over that, you can see that it mentions string, but we never actually said that it's string. The type is inferred by Kotlin to be a string. It can tell that it's a string just by looking at the value. Now, if we look at this one here, this is a variable called y, and it holds the number 1. And let's see what Kotlin has inferred that to be. And yeah, it's inferred it to be an int. So it's inferred to be an int because it can clearly see that the value that you've assigned it is int. So what if we want to declare a variable, but we actually want to initialize the variable later? So let's try that here. We've declared X and we get an error, which you can see with the red underline. If we hover over it, it says this variable must either have a type annotation or be initialized. Okay, so we can't declare it without giving it a value or a type. So let's just comment that out. And we can see another declaration here, which doesn't assign a value, but it does declare the type of string, and that's absolutely fine, no errors. And the reason for that is that Kotlin doesn't know the type and therefore can't impose the appropriate constraints because Kotlin is a strongly typed language. So let's just try and print this string out. And you can see that we get an error because, well, let's just hover over the error. It says variable z or variable z must be initialized. Now we haven't actually given it a value. We have to give it a value before we can print it out. So if we say it equals, okay, and now we can print it out fine. All right, so let's just revert that and let's comment that out. By the way, if you want to stay up to date with the latest Kotlin tutorials and info, then don't forget to subscribe. And for more general tech content, check out the main channel, which I'll link to in the description below. All right, where were we? So as I mentioned earlier, variables aren't always very variable in Kotlin. So let's explain what I mean by that. Val, the keyword, declares a variable that is immutable, in other words, read only. Okay, so here we have a variable called X declared with the val keyword, and the value is 1. Now, if I try to reassign that to 2, I can no longer change that value. So it's kind of fixed, hold as a value there, read only. So let's just comment that out again. All right, so what if we do want to declare a variable that is actually mutable? We can change the value as we go along through the program. Well, we can declare that with the var keyword, and it looks very similar when they're next to each other, both 3-letter keywords beginning with VA, so it's quite hard to spot. But the var keyword means that you will allow this value to be reassigned, to be changed, okay? So we have var x equals 1, and here we're setting the value to 2. So at this point forwards, the variable x will hold the value 2, not 1, and that's absolutely fine. Now we're going to use the words mutate or not to mutate in this context, but in reality, those concepts are a little bit more complicated. In this case, we're just using them to think of them very simply as values that you can change, you can mutate, and values that you can't change. In other words, you cannot mutate. So val is something that you cannot mutate, and that's the one that I recommend using by default. And I recommend only using the var keyword, which is a mutable field, only if you really need to change the value to change the assignment. Okay. Now, immutability refers to the idea that things don't change as you go along, and that's a very good thing in programming. Now, I've come up with an example here, which I'm not entirely sure is a very good example, but I'm going to try and give it anyway. And let me know in the comments below whether it made any sense or not. So imagine you had a box and you could open that box just once a day. And every time you open that box, you were given £100 or $100. You could rely on it and you could make very easy buying decisions because you know that you're going to get £100 every day from that box. But if every time you open that box and you could only open it once a day, you got a different amount, you would not easily be able to make buying decisions as you went through life because you wouldn't know how much money you were going to get from day to day. Now, in the same way, things that don't change in programming make code much easier to reason about. They become effectively like facts. You can rely on them. All right, so that's my little example to try and explain the value of immutable things in programming. Let me know if that made any sense to you in the comment section below. So far we've seen local variables that exist inside a code block, a method, but you can also have class level variables. These are called properties, and we'll go into those in a lot more detail in another video. But for now, let's look at an example. We've got a val, which remember is something that you can't change. It's read only, and we call that URL. And we've given that a value, which is just a website URL. And then we've got another one, which is a var. so it really is variable. It can be changed, and we've called that age and given it the value 22. We can print both of those out in a very simple way, and we can access them from this function. So far so good. So why would you want to declare these kind of instance level variables? Well, if I declare a variable inside this function, it can only be accessed inside that function. But if I declare things at the instance level here, at the class level, they can be accessed by other functions and other code blocks inside that class, okay? Now, one of the constraints to be aware of is that you can't declare read-only instance variables without setting a value, even with a type. So let's just try that. And you see we get an error message. So let's see what that says. Property must be initialized. You must give it a value. Let's just comment that out. And obviously that's in contrast to local variables, because in local variables, you can just declare the type and the name, and then afterwards give it a value before you actually use the variable, but that's different here. And the same goes for instance variables. So let's try a variable rather than a value. Yeah, and we get the same thing. We get an error message telling us that it must be initialized. All right, now let's try to modify these instance variables and see what happens. So in this modify method here, we're going to try to change the URL, and we get an error message because obviously vals cannot be reassigned. And we don't get any error on the age variable because that's declared as a var, which is absolutely fine to change. Okay, I hope that was useful. Drop me a comment in the comment section below if you have any feedback at all. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.